Hello, I'm Chris Smith, and I am one of the pastors at Covenant Presbyterian Church here in St. Louis. And right up front, I want to say how pleased I am that you are participating this year in the Fellowship of Former Christian Scientists National Conference. It really is an honor and a privilege to be able to share with you today. And I'm so glad that you are taking the time to listen as I try and tell the story of Gnosticism and Christian Science, a story that you may not be familiar with, but one that I think is important. Today we're going to take a look at the story of Christian Science and Gnosticism. I know there are a number of places that we could start the story. We're going to begin with what happened on April 12th, 1879. On that day, Mary Baker Eddy and some of her followers came together and held a meeting, and there was in this meeting a motion made by Mrs. Eddy, and this is what the motion said. To organize a church designed to commemorate the word and works of our Master, which should reinstate primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. I want to start the story there today because of what this statement says about what the Christian Science Church is intending, what story they're intending to embody, and what story they're intending to tell. Particularly, I want to focus in on that claim that they are seeking to reinstate primitive Christianity. We're going to take a look at that story, and I'm just going to give you a little preview of where we're headed. I'm going to make the case that actually the story of Christian Science does not show us that it was reinstating primitive Christianity, but rather Christian Science is a primitive heresy. First of all, just a brief timeline of Christian Science. I know this will be familiar for some of you, but not for all of you. Back before that first meeting on April 12th in 1879, there was, in 1866, on February 1st, at the corner of Oxford and Market Streets, there was a patch of ice that Mary Baker Eddy slipped on, and when she slipped on that patch of ice, she fell and hit her head and suffered. It's a little bit up for debate what happened exactly, but it was a serious injury that knocked her unconscious. Some people say it wasn't as serious as she claimed, but others said that she was near death, which is what she herself claimed. But that fall on the ice in Lynn, Massachusetts was in some ways the beginning of Christian Science, because she then, through the practice of Christian Science, she found a healing from her fall, which she said had her near death. Next, in 1875, she publishes the first edition of Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, which of course has gone through numerous editions. The copy I pulled up here says it's gone through 9 million copies sold. I'm sure it's well beyond that as well. And then in 1879, what we just looked at, the Church of Christ Scientist, another name for the Christian Science Church, was founded in Boston with that statement that we just read. So, Christian Science, is it a return to primitive Christianity, or is it a return to a primitive heresy? Now, I don't want to take for granted that all of us are on the same page as to what a heresy is, what I'm referring to. So let me just take a moment and define what I'm talking about. A heresy, for our purposes today, is a teaching that compromises an essential doctrine, losing sight of who God is. So literally, heresy means choice. That is, a choice to deviate from traditional Orthodox teaching in favor of one's own insights. Now, heresy is not the same thing as error. Error can be harmful, but heresy is catastrophic. All heresies are errors, but not all errors are heresy. If we think about that for a moment, that language of harmful and catastrophic, I would imagine that if I were to eat a bag of Doritos for breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day, that would probably be harmful to me. And I would imagine my doctor or certainly my personal trainer would say that for optimum health, you don't want to do that. In fact, you eating 3 bags of Doritos every day is harmful to your health and to your life. But eating a bag of Doritos 3 times a day is harmful. But if I were to take just a couple cyanide pills, just a few 100 milligrams, it wouldn't just be harmful, it would be catastrophic. And so that's the difference that we're talking about between harmful and catastrophic. There are errors that all churches and Christians embrace, often unknowingly or because we are not infallible. But those errors, when they cross the line into heresy, it's because they are catastrophic. On the other hand, the opposite of heresy is orthodoxy. And here's the definition I'm going to use here. I'm getting both of these definitions, by the way, from Justin Holcomb's helpful book, Know the Heretics. And he defines orthodoxy this way: the teaching that best follows the Bible and summarizes what it teaches. It best accounts for the paradoxes and apparent contradictions. It best preserves the mystery and best communicates the story of forgiveness offered in the gospel. And the Apostles' Creed, for example, is a good example of an ancient and concise summary of Orthodox teaching. So is Christian Science a return to primitive Christianity, or is it a primitive heresy? Well, I'm going to argue that it's a primitive heresy. As I said, now something about heresies is that they are ancient. We see them all the way back to the beginning of the church, shortly after the resurrection of Jesus, the appearance of the earliest writings of the New Testament, and the formation of the New Testament church. Almost immediately, heresies spring up. And many of those heresies were the church defended itself and its beliefs against those heresies, and oftentimes defeating them. But these heresies, they tend to be persistent. They tend to pop up over and over again throughout history, even though the church dealt with really most of these heresies, if not all of them, in the earliest centuries of the church. I think the reason why those heresies are persistent is because those heresies represent common ways that the human heart drifts from the truth and from orthodoxy. So heresies just tend to be, they don't appear in the exact same form, but they tend to be recycled, repackaged, refashioned, and so maybe a heresy is dressed up in different clothing, or some parts of a heresy are recycled and others aren't, but they tend to show up over and over again. And it's a poignant reminder of what we read in Ecclesiastes 1, that there's nothing new under the sun, and that applies to heresies as well. Well, let's take a little bit closer look at Christian Science and the claim that it's a primitive heresy. I'm going to say that Christian Science is a Gnostic heresy, and I need to tell you a little bit about what Gnosticism is. So Gnosticism was one of the earliest heresies to plague the Christian church. It appeared as early as the 2nd century. Some say earlier. It's pretty hard to establish that definitively. We know that because we've found some of the writings of some of the earliest Gnostics, but in addition to that, we have several church fathers who wrote against and defended the Christian faith, orthodoxy, against Gnostic heresies. In particular, probably the most prominent was Irenaeus, who was the bishop of Lyon. He lived from 130 to 202 AD, and his book, Against Heresies, was a refutation of a Gnostic heresy, especially what was called Valentinianism. It was one of the species of Gnosticism, and that's the one that he mainly took on in that book. This century has, or this heresy rather, has been around since the early 2nd century. And Gnosticism, if you were to take a deeper dive into this, which we don't have time for today, is an umbrella term that refers to many different movements that arose in Syria and Egypt and Persia and throughout the Middle East. And there really is, in many cases, quite a bit of variety and quite a bit of difference between some of these different kinds of Gnosticism. And some have even questioned, is Gnosticism, is it even meaningful given the differences that we see in these different movements? But I'm going to argue that we can gather at least some basic teachings that most of these Gnostic groups share under an umbrella that will make it meaningful for us to use. And Gnosticism, that word comes from the Greek word gnosis, which simply means knowledge. And we'll talk a little bit more in a moment about why it's called Gnosticism and how knowledge features so prominently in the name and in the practice of this heresy. Well, Gnosticism has been, in some cases, it's been all the rage in the past few years. Here's an Oxford edition of Introduction to Gnosticism, Elaine Pagel's book, Gnostic Gospels, the Nag Hammadi Scriptures, which is in reference to an archaeological find in the 20th century that unearthed a number of Gnostic documents. N.T. Wright wrote a book about a Gnostic gospel called the Gospel of Judas. You may have heard about that in the last several years. And of course, I bet you're familiar with this on some level. Maybe you've read it, the book, The Da Vinci Code. Though it's a novel, it claims to be presenting a true and accurate history. And the kind of one of the central claims of the book is that the Christian church has privileged one set of documents over another, and that these secret gospels, Gnostic gospels, have been buried and suppressed, and that, in fact, this represents a truer tradition about who Jesus was, but it's been suppressed for political and doctrinal reasons by the powerful and so forth. And boy, I bet there are at least a dozen books that take up the claims of the Da Vinci Code and show a lot of problems with the claims that Dan Brown and some of the people he's leaning on make. But nevertheless, that has popularized some of the ideas of the Gnostic Gospels. In particular, one of the things that Brown wanted to say was that the Gnostic Gospels presented a more human Jesus, and also was not so male-dominated, but gave a greater place of prominence to women. I actually think that the Gnostic Gospels show just the opposite of both of those claims. If you are to read that body of literature, you'll see that it's not a more human Jesus that they present. It's one who is more detached and one who does not emphasize his humanity. And as well, and I'll show you a selection about this in a moment, I don't think that it does give women a prominent place. I think the historical Gospels do a much better job of that. And I want to just show you just two sections of a Gnostic Gospel, just so you can get a flavor for what they're like. If I'm going to make the claim that Christian Science is a return to a primitive heresy, the primitive heresy of Gnosticism, I want you to see a little bit of the language of a couple of these Gnostic documents. So I just made a couple selections. This is from one of the Gnostic writings called the Sophia of Jesus Christ. Sophia is a Greek word, just means wisdom, the wisdom of Jesus Christ. It's from, estimates are maybe 150 to 250 AD. And this is just a selection that I chose out of the Sophia of Jesus Christ. I want you to listen to this language, and then as I go on to explain some of the central tenets of Gnosticism, I think you'll see that that some of the language that you hear here is going to be reflected in what I talk about the main tenets of Gnosticism. The perfect Savior said, "I want you to know that he who appeared before the universe in infinity, self-grown, self-constructed Father, being full of shining light and ineffable in the beginning, when he decided to have his likeness become a great power, immediately the principle, or beginning, of that light appeared as immortal androgynous man, that through that immortal androgynous man they might attain their salvation and awake from forgetfulness through the interpreter who was sent, who was with you until the end of the poverty of the robbers. First man has his unique mind within and thought, just as he is it, thought, and considering, reflecting, rationality, power. All the attributes that exist are perfect and immortal. In respect to imperishableness, they are indeed equal. But in respect to power, they are different, like the difference between Father and Son and thought, and the thought and the remainder. As I said earlier, among the things that were created, the monad is first." Now, if you're familiar with the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this probably sounds pretty strange to you. I think, actually, if you have read in Mary Baker Eddy's writings, Science and Health, and other writings, I think you might hear a little bit of resonance here between what is said here and the kind of language that's used there as well. Here's another selection. This is from the Gospel of Thomas. Is probably the most famous of these documents. Some claim it's on the border and it's maybe not quite a Gnostic document. Nevertheless, there are at least some proto-Gnostic thoughts and tenets aired here. And so what I decided to do here is just to give you the very first selection and the very last selection from the Gospel of Thomas. So this is how the Gospel of Thomas opens. "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down." And here's the first saying. "And he said, whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death." And there are 112 more sayings between the first one and the last one, and then here's the last saying, 114. "Simon Peter said to him, 'Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life.' Jesus said, 'I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.'" Again, very kind of strange language, at least to my ears. I would assume to many of yours as well. And quite subverts the claim, I think, that at least Dan Brown makes, that this gives a higher position. It seems to be doesn't offer a higher position to women, but seems to be rather an invalidation of being a woman even. So I don't think there's much for us in these Gnostic documents, and as a matter of fact, that's why the church did not include them in the canon. By the way, if you want to hear more about that and about the reliability and authority of the scriptures and so forth, I'm going to do another seminar I'll tell you more about at the end that I welcome you to attend if you'd like later in the conference. So there's a couple samples from a couple Gnostic documents. Now I want to summarize. I said there's a lot of variety and many differences between different Gnosticisms, but I'm gonna gather three main tenets of Gnosticism that I think show up over and over again in different varieties of Gnosticism, and that I think we're also going to see are present as we take a look at Christian Science as well. Those three tenets are, first of all, radical dualism, and there are a lot of different dualisms that you could have, but this dualism in particular concerns spirit versus matter. So first of all, radical dualism, spirit versus matter. Secondly, we're going to look at the doctrine of God, and Gnosticism's doctrine of God is often a God that is transcendent, that is beyond us, inaccessible, out of reach, unapproachable, but not immanent. That is, near to us, involved with his creation and creatures, speaking and revealing to them and so forth. And therefore, because God is transcendent, God is unknowable. And then thirdly, the third main tenet we're going to take a look at today is secret knowledge. And I told you the word Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, knowledge. And that's one of the key features, is, and you saw it in the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas there. These are the great sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke, and which Judas Thomas wrote down. So here's the secrets. Here they are. It's secret knowledge. It's esoteric knowledge. And you need to know it from this document, or you're going to be on the outside. Esoteric and secret knowledge, and only for the elite, for an elite class. So let's start by taking a look at radical dualism and see if radical dualism shows up in Christian Science. Well, we're going to start with something for those of you who are former Christian scientists. This will be familiar to you. This is the scientific statement of being from Science and Health, and this is what Mary Baker Eddy in the Christian Science Church says. My first plank in the platform of Christian Science is as follows: there is no life, truth, intelligence, nor substance in matter. All is infinite mind and its infinite manifestation, for God is all in all. Spirit is immortal truth. Matter is mortal error. Spirit is the real and eternal. Matter is the unreal and temporal. Spirit is God, and man in his image and likeness. Therefore, man is not material, he is spiritual. I don't have to do too much there to convince you. I don't think that you see here a pretty radical dualism between spirit and matter. Just look at that middle section there. Spirit is immortal, matter is mortal. Spirit is immortal truth, matter is mortal error. Spirit is the real and eternal, matter is the unreal and temporal. Spirit is God, and therefore man is not material, he is spiritual. So as we see this radical dualism, this dualism between spirit and matter, this is what we see over and over again in Gnosticism, and we see in Christian Science as well. Spirit versus matter. So immaterial is good. Material is bad. Spirit and mind are good. Body is bad. Abstract and the timeless are good. The particular and the historical are bad. The infinite is good and the finite is bad. One is preferable to the other. It's that first category. That's what should receive the emphasis. In fact, Christian Science will say that is actually the truth. In the other category, the other column, material, body, particular, historical, finite, that's all actually illusion. And over again in Gnosticism, this is a key emphasis. Matter is where the problem is. It's the problem that is limiting us. It is the problem that causes problems for us. It's limiting. It's contaminated. It's base and mundane, and therefore, because that's what matter is, then matter is either denigrated or disparaged or avoided or ignored or disregarded. In fact, matter is so disparaged in Christian Science that Christian Science maintains that matter is not reality. It's actually an illusion. So we see this material dualism it's very clear in the tenets of Gnosticism, and it's very clear here in Christian Science. In fact, this is maybe one of the more prominent things that shows us that Christian Science is, in many ways, it's a recycling or repackaging of this primitive heresy. Obviously, this leads to Christian Science's most notorious and well-known practice, and that is foregoing medical care. Because matter doesn't matter. In fact, if you knew the truth, you would understand that, in fact, matter and all that attends matter, sin and sickness and death, they actually don't exist. And so why would you succumb to a lie and submit yourself to medical treatment when, if you just know the truth, that it's spirit that matters, because it's actually spirit that only exists, everything else is illusory, then you will find your healing. So Gnosticism, that first main tenet of Gnosticism, is radical dualism, spirit versus matter, and we see that in Christian Science. The second one is that I want to take a look at is the doctrine of God. Who is God? The main tenet in Gnosticism is a transcendent God, but not one that's immanent or knowable. This is a selection from Science and Health, page 469, where we read this. Intelligence is omniscience, omnipresence, and omnipotence. It is the primal and eternal quality of infinite mind, of the triune principle, life, truth, and love, named God. Mind is God. Now, what we see here in the doctrine of God is that God is unknowable because God is impersonal. Christian Science reduces God to a philosophical universal principle. God is entirely distant and abstract and impersonal. And why wouldn't he be, given the radical dualism that exists? If God is pure, spirit is immaterial, he needs to remain remote from matter, period. It would sully him, contaminate him otherwise. And so, given that radical dualism, which even God is subject to, God remains remote, unknowable, unavailable, distant, abstract, impersonal. And over again, you find that that Christian Science refers to God in abstract terms rather than personal terms. And it's difficult to be devoted to an amorphous, impersonal principle. It's like being warmly devoted to world peace. It's kind of hard to get your hands on and get your hands around. And I think because of that, what we see is less devotion to God, because after all, who is God? God is unknowable. God is impersonal, and we see more devotion to a system. In fact, I think what we see is more devotion to a person as well. The person of Mary Baker Eddy, who was the first and only pastor of a Christian Science church, and who is revered by many Christian scientists. She represents something personal, which I believe the human heart longs for, and an amorphous, impersonal, distant, inaccessible principle is hard to be devoted to. And so I believe some of that devotion funnels to Mary Baker Eddy. Even I've heard her name spoken by not only current but even former Christian scientists, often in reverential terms. With a real warmth and affection, speaking intimately of Mrs. Eddy, wanting to guard her reputation and so forth. I think that's because in Christian Science, God is so remote and impersonal and unknowable. It increases the attractiveness of someone who is particular and historical, like Mary Baker Eddy. I think it not only leads to less devotion to God and more devotion to a person, but also, as I said here, more devotion to a system. And I mean by that, science and health, how that's read and used and practiced. In fact, science and health is the pastor now ongoing in Christian Science churches, because it has the truth that you need to know. It's got the knowledge that's important for you to know. And so that's what you can be devoted to, something that's particular, that's accessible, that you can read and study and so forth. So I think we see that there's a kind of a distance and a transcendent, unknowable, impersonal God in Christian Science, just like in Gnosticism. And that ends up funneling towards Mary Baker Eddy and towards science and health. Which leads us to our third tenet of Gnosticism, radical dualism, spirit versus matter, the doctrine of God, where God is transcendent but not immanent and therefore unknowable, and then finally secret knowledge. I said that if God is impersonal and abstract and remote, then you need something that you can get your hands on, that you can be devoted to, and science and health is one of those things that Christian scientists can be devoted to, get their hands on, can read and study, and it's where the secret knowledge is contained. It's where the gnosis, the special knowledge that only Christian scientists have, where it's found. It's where the truth is found about the fact that matter, that sin, death, and disease is all illusory. It's all in science and health. So that third component of that third tenet of Gnosticism, esoteric knowledge. So a number of quotes here from Mary Baker Eddy, and also one commenting on her life that will show you the character of what science and health is, and is argued to be, setting it apart as special, and as even as revelation, I think, and as special esoteric knowledge that only Christian scientists have. No human pen nor tongue taught me the science contained in this book, Science and Health. So if no human pen or tongue taught her, the implication is that this came to her by divine revelation. What you have in Science and Health, the claim is from Mary Baker Eddy, is it's of divine origin. Science and Health 107, in the year 1866, this is after her fall on the ice, I discovered the Christ science, or divine laws of life, truth and love, and named my discovery Christian Science. God had been graciously preparing me during many years for the reception of this final revelation of the absolute divine principle of scientific healing. In other words, there's a final revelation that no one else throughout history had, and now I've received the final piece of the puzzle, this special, necessary, esoteric knowledge, and I've written it down here. Here it is in Science and Health. Another quote, I should blush to write of science and health with key to the scriptures as I have, were it of human origin, and were I, apart from God, its author. But as I was only a scribe echoing the harmonies of heaven and divine metaphysics, I cannot be super modest in my estimate of the Christian Science textbook. Again, Mary Baker Eddy is claiming that this knowledge is special, it's esoteric, and it is of divine origin. And then finally, two quotes, one by her and one by Christian Science commenting on her. The literal rendering of the scriptures makes them nothing valuable, but often is the foundation of unbelief and hopelessness. The metaphysical rendering is health and peace and hope for all. Now, I want to get behind the quotation here, explain what she's saying. She's saying if you just read the Bible on its own, it is not clear. And in fact, it can often lead to be the foundation of unbelief and hopelessness. What you need is a key. You need a metaphysical rendering. Guess who provides that, by the way? Mary Baker Eddy and Science and Health provides that key so that you can understand the metaphysical rendering behind the scriptures that is health and peace and hope for all. And then finally, this is from a book by Thomas Leichman called Why I'm a Christian Scientist. And he says, no honest overseer can overlook the fact that the Christianly scientific rule which she, Mary Baker Eddy, established and interpreted for mankind had not been previously discovered by any of the countless students of these same scriptures in the centuries that had passed since they were recorded. No one in the history of the church, and no one who has read the scriptures has ever had this specific knowledge, this esoteric knowledge that's necessary until Mary Baker Eddy, until she discovered it. So that secret knowledge, that esoteric gnosis, Science and Health, look at the name of the book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. This is where the real gnosis is found, the key that unlocks that which is unavailable to those who don't have the key. The book is well named because it does claim to be a key. It claims to offer a special secret knowledge that no one else has. What is that key? Well, that key is, it's knowing the truth about God, that God is impersonal and unknowable and remote. It's knowing the truth about yourself, that you're spiritual and not material. It's knowing the truth about reality and that you need to wake up to it. Knowing that the impersonal God principle made you his perfect child, which mainly means that you are perfect and you are spiritual as opposed to material. All you need to do is realize this. Wake up to it. Get rid of your illusions. The spiritual is all there is. There's no material. There's no sin, disease, death. You just need to realize that. That's the key, the secret knowledge that no one else knows. That's what the key is. And this is also something we see in Gnosticism, and I think we see a bit of this in Christian Science as well. When you have esoteric, secret knowledge, it often leads to elitism. And some of you, if you're former Christian scientists, you may have referred to yourself this way. A number of former Christian scientists I know have told me this, that they thought of themselves and referred to themselves sometimes as graduate school Christians. It's not surprising that they would view themselves as graduate school Christians because they had advanced training. They had esoteric knowledge that could only be gotten from Mary Baker Eddy in Science and Health. And so elitism often goes hand in hand with that esoteric knowledge. So Gnosticism, its main tenets, radical dualism, the spirit versus matter, the doctrine of God, where God is transcendent and therefore unknowable and inaccessible, and lastly, possessing a secret knowledge, an esoteric knowledge that's only for the elite, for the Green Berets. That's what we see as the main tenets of Gnosticism, and I think that we see all of those in Christian Science as well. So that opening statement, the claim that Mary Baker Eddy and others made as they organized a church that was designed to commemorate the word and works of our Master, which should reinstate primitive Christianity and its lost element of healing. I think that claim is mistaken. It's badly mistaken. It's not actually a primitive Christianity, but it's the reinstatement of a primitive heresy. A recycled and repackaged version for sure, one that doesn't share complete overlap with all Gnostic systems, to be sure, but at its heart, a recycled, repackaged version of the primitive heresy of Gnosticism. That, I believe, is really the true story of Christian Science and Gnosticism. They're not only bedfellows, but rather Christian Science is just another version, another species of Gnosticism. Thanks for your time and attention, for listening or watching this presentation. I want to let you know that I'm happy to entertain questions. I know we're going to have some time here in a few minutes to do some question and answer. I encourage you to stick around for that, especially if I've not been clear about something, or you want to ask something else or challenge something that I've said. I would love to be able to interact with you. I also want to welcome you, in addition to the Q&A time that we'll have. Whether you don't feel like engaging in that, or you think of something later, you're also welcome to engage me via email. And if you were to contact Katie through the FFCS website, she'd be happy to forward any emails on to me, and I'd be happy to talk with you further about any of these matters. In closing, I just want to encourage you as well to check out the other two seminars that I'll be offering later in the conference. The next one I'm going to be talking about, or the topic of the next seminar is Can I Trust the Bible? The authority and reliability of the Scriptures. I've kind of taken science and health to task a little bit, and I have taken the Gnostic Gospels to task a little bit, and it's only fair to say, well, okay, what about the Scriptures? Are they reliable? Do they have any real authority? And so I'm going to take a look at that in that seminar. And again, I encourage you, if you have questions about that, or if you wonder about that, we're actually going to take a look at a statement that Mary Baker Eddy made about how untrustworthy the Scriptures are, and about the numerous errors and mistranslations that you find. We're going to put that under the microscope and examine that a little bit. So I encourage you to tune in to that one, or to watch it later if you don't get a chance to. And then lastly, on the final day of the conference, I'm going to teach a seminar called What's the Difference Between Christian Science and Biblical Christianity? I've had to intentionally bite my tongue here as we've looked at some of these claims, the main tenets of both Gnosticism and Christian Science as a variety of Gnosticism. I've wanted to articulate how Christianity deals with some of these things, how the Christian faith engages some of these questions about a radical dualism, or about the nature of God, the doctrine of God, about whether or not there's esoteric knowledge or what. I've wanted to engage that and talk about how the Christian faith views those things differently, I think in ways that are unique and commendable. But I didn't want to do that in this presentation. That would be false advertising. That's not what we wanted to consider here. But I do invite you, if you have questions or you'd be interested in investigating that, to join me for that final seminar on the last day, What's the Difference Between Christian Science and Biblical Christianity, where we'll take a look and put them side by side a little bit and see how it is, what the claims that each of them makes, and how they're different. Hey, thanks again for sticking with me throughout this, and I hope this conference is a real blessing to you, no matter where you are, no matter where you're coming from, whether you have a background in Christian Science, whether you're completely new to Christian Science. We're glad that you're here, and it's a real privilege to have you spend this kind of time with me as I've talked about the story of Gnosticism and Christian Science. Thanks.